In Unit 3, I'm going to be discussing the rise of authoritarian and totalitarian states, dictatorships, and things like this. Some of these occur quite early in terms of the context of this class, so it goes back to the roots of World War I and the early post-war era, and some occur later, depending on who comes into office and such. So I'd like to first talk in the next few sections about what happened in Russia during the First World War that leads to the abdication of the Tsar and the rise of the communist regime in Russia. So let me first take you back to the rule of Tsar Nicholas II. Tsar means, it's like a word for like Caesar or Kaiser. It's an emperor type term for Russia. Russia was the largest empire on the planet at the turn of the century in terms of landmass. And even today, Russia is the world's largest country. It's actually, just Russia proper today is 1/6 of the world, of the planet, of the land on the planet. It is a very, very large nation with multiple time zones, 5-6 time zones, to cover the span of land. In the early part of the turn of the century, in 1905, I had mentioned that Russia had went to war with Japan, and it was a debacle, really, for the Russians, and some people saw this as a sign to push finally for change against a monarchy that had done very little to reform over the last few hundred years, where many of the monarchies of Western Europe had lessened their role and their power by creating parliaments that had shared power, or in many ways given up virtual power to parliaments as well. As, for example, in Great Britain, the king or queen had very little influence or power, and has very little today as well. That's not the case in Russia at the turn of the century. Nicholas II is still ruling in a belief in divine right, that he was chosen by God to be the ruler of Russia, and that he, the people referred to the Tsar as their little father, and he truly believed in this role, that he had this paternalistic attitude, that he was taking care of children, and that any reform should come from him, and he refused really to lessen any type of influence or control of the government. And in 1905, in the war with Japan, he's challenged really for the first time. There are revolts in Russia. There's something called Bloody Sunday we won't get into, and it pushes the Tsar to offer a manifesto of changes, and this is called the October Manifesto, and it was basically a promise for a liberal bourgeois type government that you might have seen in the West, a promise that the Duma, which was a parliament type body that had very little power, would be convened and would be given the ability to make some changes and reforms and such in Russia. Well, over the next 5 to 10 years after 1905, what happens is the Tsar gives some power, but as soon as he sees that it is going to be his own authority as a challenge, he dismisses the Duma. So the first Duma comes in. It has a very liberal Enlightenment type agenda, a democratic agenda. It's calling for universal suffrage. They're calling for representation throughout the countryside, and a similar society that you would see, for example, in Great Britain. And Great Britain's always the model that many nations that are trying to reform are looking to, because it was such a great power. They see that their government is a reason for those advantages. Well, so Dumas are formed, and then Dumas are denied or dismissed. So this first Duma comes about, and it is quickly canceled and sends them home. Many of these people then go to Finland to try to drum up support for some kind of independent government kind of initiative, and many of those people are later captured and sent to prison. Over the Tsar's term, there's going to be 3 Dumas, each with getting less and less power, and each with less and less influence. So virtually, the 1905 incident is supposedly going to push Russia, but as time goes on, the Tsar generally just pulls back, goes back to the same old patterns. And meanwhile, Russia is industrializing, but in comparison to the West, it has a long way to go. At the turn of the century, for example, the amount of rail line, which is a very strong indicator of industrialization, and for a country that is this huge at the turn of the century, it had less rail line than the little tiny country of Serbia. There is progress being made, though, so we're not going to say that there's no progress, but it's not going fast enough, possibly. And when they're going to enter into World War I, it's really going to highlight that they're not ready yet, that they're just the beginning stages of mass industrialization and urbanization. When the war begins in 1914, if you remember, Tsar Nicholas II mobilizes his troops towards the borders, in which indicates to Kaiser Wilhelm II that a big war is going to start, and that's when he attacks France. As I mentioned earlier, many soldiers went off to that first battle with no guns. The policy, and this is the same policy that ends up having in World War II as well. You go off with a soldier as a gun, and when that soldier dies or another soldier dies, then you pick up a gun. There was a mass army, and they thought this would be the key to winning a future war. They had 12 million men they were able to mobilize, a huge, vast fighting force. But the key to World War I is mechanization, is industrialization, is producing enough shells, and having an economic backing and banking system to pay for such a endeavor. Russia is not ready for that. In the beginning of World War I, there's early successes, as I mentioned before. The tables were turned, though, and many of the soldiers are going to start abandoning the front and heading back. So chaos generally is erupting on the front. And meanwhile, back in St. Petersburg, the capital, which at that time period was changed to the name Petrograd. Grad is a Russian ending that means city, city of Peter. They got rid of Petersburg because Berg is a German-sounding name. And they go in Petrograd. There is worker strikes happening, and women go out and strike in February of 1917, and they're joined by soldiers and other factory workers, and it leads into this mass revolt, basically. And at that point, the Tsar loses control of Russia, and he abdicates the throne. What comes in is a government that is split between two forces. Groups called Soviets, which are councils. The word Soviet means council. Radical left-wing councils, basically. And a Duma is going to form of this more liberal bourgeois kind of formation. But their power is limited because they have to answer to these Soviets or councils. And who are they made up in the councils? They're made up of soldiers and workers and some peasants. And they're looking for vast, quick changes, and they're going to turn to radical leaders who are going to help them try to achieve those vast, quick changes.